When the light changes. Chapter 1. The Arrival. The morning came gray and cold, the kind that made the sea sound heavier against the stones. Eleanor sat by the window with her tea, the cup cooling faster than she could drink it. The mailman had come early, his boots sharp on the gravel. She hadn't expected anything. Not anymore. The envelope lay on the table. Plain. Cream-colored. Her name written in a hand she hadn't seen in 50 years. The ink had bled slightly where the letters curled, Eleanor Marsh. She looked at it for a long time before touching it. She didn't open it right away. Some things needed waiting. Outside, the tide was pulling out, leaving a wide strip of wet sand where the gulls picked through seaweed. She watched them, small and quick and certain of themselves. Her own hands trembled. She thought of how many years had passed since a letter had made her afraid. When she did open it, she used a butter knife, sliding the blade under the seal as if it were something fragile. The paper was heavy, faintly yellowed. Only one page. No return address. No date. Eleanor, I have thought of writing for years. I never did, and that was a kind of cowardice. I don't know if you are well, or if you would want to hear from me. I only wanted to say that I was wrong, and that I remember you by the river, with the wind in your hair, laughing at something I said that wasn't funny. If you wish to write, the address below will find me. James. She read it twice. The words didn't change, but the room did. The kettle's hum seemed distant. The walls leaned in. The sea outside went silent for a moment, or maybe it only seemed that way. James. The name alone was a wave breaking after a long calm. She said it aloud, testing the sound. Her voice cracked in the middle. Then she laughed, quietly, because of how foolish it felt. She folded the letter and unfolded it again. The paper carried a faint scent, salt, perhaps, or dust, or the ghost of old books. She touched the edge of the page with her thumb. Her heart, slow for so long, began to move differently. He had been her beginning once. And her ending, too. She stood and walked to the window. The sea looked endless, as always. 50 years of tides, and still it moved the same way. She wondered if he looked at it, too, wherever he was. The house was quiet. Her husband had been dead 8 years. Her daughter lived in Canada, teaching philosophy, sending emails instead of letters. Eleanor taught no one now. She wrote a little, read a little, lived in the small cottage that smelled of cedar and tea leaves. It was enough. Or had been. The letter sat on the table, waiting. She felt its presence behind her as she washed the cup. It felt almost alive. When the phone rang, she jumped. It was Anna, a friend from the next village. Still alive then? Anna said, her voice brisk. Barely, Eleanor said. What's the weather like there? Gray. The kind that makes you want to start over or give up. Don't do either. Come to supper. I've got lamb and a bottle open. Not tonight. You sound strange. I've had a letter. A letter? From who? Eleanor hesitated. Someone I used to know. That could mean anything. Is he married? He might be dead. Even better. No complications. Eleanor smiled despite herself. Goodbye, Anna. Bring him if he's breathing, Anna said, and hung up. The rest of the day passed as if the world were slightly tilted. She tried to read, but the words refused to stay still. She went for a walk along the cliff path, her scarf drawn tight against the wind. The air smelled of kelp and rain. Every sound, the gulls, the grass, the far-off crash of waves, felt sharper, as if the world had been scrubbed clean. Memory came not as a flood, but in small, bright flashes. James's hand reaching for hers across a cafe table in Paris. His voice saying something reckless in bad French. The way his hair caught the light when he bent over his camera. How young they both were. Too proud, too certain. She had written to him once, long after he left. The letter came back unopened. She had kept it anyway, in a drawer with other small defeats. Now he was writing. Now, after all this time. At dusk, she sat again at the table. She took a sheet of stationery from the drawer, smoothed it flat, and uncapped her pen. The ink hesitated at the nib, a tiny bead of black, waiting. She wrote his name first, James, then stopped. The pen hung in the air. She hadn't expected this, to be unsure what language belonged to them anymore. The words that once came so easily now felt foreign. She tore the page and began again. I remember the river. That was all she wrote. It was enough for one evening. Night came early. She lit a lamp and watched the rain start against the glass. The storm outside was light but steady. In the flicker of the lamp, The letter on the table looked almost warm, as though it were still being written somewhere. She poured a glass of wine, sat in the chair by the fire, and let herself remember more than she meant to. The Paris streets in spring, the smell of smoke and coffee, students chanting beneath the trees, James laughing at something foolish she'd said, the sound of it cutting through the city noise. Then silence. Months later, a silence that had lasted half a century. She had learned to live with it. But silence, once broken, never returns to the same shape. Later that night, she dreamed of the river. Not the real one, perhaps, but the one memory keeps, soft and gold under the bridges, slow moving, the air filled with dust and light. James stood on the far bank, camera in hand, trying to catch her as she walked. When he smiled, she felt it before she saw it. Then he turned away, and the dream folded back into darkness. She woke before dawn. The house was cold. The letter lay where she had left it, folded again, but she knew it by heart now. Outside, the sky was beginning to pale, a thin blue over the sea. She filled the kettle, set it on the stove, and whispered his name once, quietly. Not as a wish or a plea, only a sound that had waited too long to be spoken. When the tea was ready, she sat again by the window. A new day, sharp-edged, wet with light. She felt something like youth stir in her chest. Not happiness, exactly, but the pulse of being alive in the same world as someone who once mattered more than the world itself. The page she'd written lay beside the envelope. For words, simple as a heartbeat. I remember the river. She looked at them until they felt right, then folded the page and slid it into a new envelope. She addressed it in her neat hand, the one she used to sign books and bills and letters to editors. Then she pressed the flap closed and set it near the door. She would post it in the morning. For now, she sat still, watching the first fishermen move out into the gray, their boats small against the water. The tide was turning. The day would be long. And somewhere, she thought, another letter was already on its way. Chapter 2, Paris, 1971. The first time she saw him, the air was full of rain and shouting. Students filled the street outside the Sorbonne, waving papers and flags, arguing about everything. Someone had chalked Liberté on the wall, and it ran in white streaks down to the cobblestones. Eleanor had come from the library, books pressed to her chest, when she felt a tug at her sleeve. Careful, a voice said. A man pulled her aside just as a line of police pushed through, shields up, batons flashing. He steadied her by the elbow. You nearly joined history, he said. She turned. He was tall, his jacket wet, a camera hanging from his neck. He looked older than the students, mid-20s, maybe. His accent was English, softened by time abroad. Thank you, she said, breathless. You're welcome. He lifted the camera and took her picture before she could object. The click startled her. What was that for? Insurance. In case you disappear into the crowd again. I wasn't planning to. No one ever is. He smiled, brief and unsteady, and she found herself smiling back. That night, she went to the cafe on the Boulevard Saint-Germain where the students met to argue about poetry and politics. The place smelled of coffee and smoke and wet wool. He was there, sitting alone with a notebook and a small glass of wine. When he saw her, he raised a hand in greeting, as if they'd known each other longer than an hour. She sat down. You survived the revolution, he said. Barely. My shoes didn't. He laughed, a quiet laugh that didn't reach his eyes. James, he said, offering his hand. Eleanor. They shook hands as if it meant something. They talked for hours. About the protests, the new books, the photographs he took for foreign papers. She was studying literature. He said he'd once wanted to write, but found pictures quicker than words. She told him she wrote poems. Does anyone read them? He asked. No one needs to. They're only meant to be true. He nodded. That's the same with photographs. When the waiter brought another round, he lit a cigarette and passed it to her. She hesitated, then took it, more for the gesture than the smoke. Outside, the rain began again, soft on the windows. He said, You don't look like someone who believes in causes. And you do? I believe in people who believe in them. That's a clever way to stand close and stay safe. He smiled. It's worked so far. She liked the way he said things, lightly, but with weight underneath. By midnight, most of the students had left. He walked her to her room, 3 streets away. They stopped under a lamp where the rain turned to mist. Thank you for saving me today, she said. You'd have managed. I doubt it. He looked at her for a long moment, as if deciding whether to remember her. "Good night, Eleanor," he said. She didn't sleep for hours. In the following weeks, she saw him everywhere. At protests, readings, cafes. Always the camera, always the same worn jacket. Sometimes he'd photograph her without asking. Sometimes she'd pretend not to notice. They began to spend afternoons walking along the Seine. He told her about London, about leaving it. Too many rules, too many ghosts, he said. She told him about her father, who thought poetry was a way of starving gracefully. They quarreled often, but lightly. He teased her about her seriousness. She accused him of hiding behind his lens. It was a game at first, and then it wasn't. One evening, after an argument about a photograph he'd sold to a paper that distorted the protest's message, she said, "You're not interested in truth. Only in stories." He said, "They're the same thing when you look close enough." Then he kissed her, hard, as if that were proof. They found a small room near Montparnasse with one window and a view of rooftops. It had a bed, a desk, and a stove that smoked in winter. They lived on coffee, bread, and what little money he made selling pictures. Sometimes she typed his captions for him. Sometimes he read her drafts and circled words he didn't like. They were poor, young, and certain the world was paying attention. At night, the streets echoed with music and shouting. In the mornings, the city smelled of rain and heat. They walked everywhere, always talking, always planning. Neither could imagine an ending. One afternoon, while she worked at the desk, he came in with a roll of film and said, "They want me to go south. A story about refugees crossing the border." She turned in her chair. "How long?" "A week. Maybe 2. She nodded. "Will you come back?" He laughed. "Of course." But she saw something flicker in his eyes, a shadow of the man he would later become. He left the next morning. She watched him walk down the narrow street until he turned the corner and was gone. He did come back. Weeks later, thinner, quieter, changed. He spoke less and drank more. The photographs he brought were stark and beautiful, but he hated them. "They're not what I saw," he said. "They never are," she said. He looked at her then, as if she'd betrayed him by understanding. They still loved each other, but differently now. Something had entered between them, something that watched and waited. One night, the city erupted again. A march turned violent near the river. Sirens, shouting, smoke. James went out with his camera. She followed, though he told her not to. They ran through narrow streets lit by firelight and broken glass. On the Pont Neuf, he turned and shouted for her to stay back. Then a surge of people came between them. When she reached the other side, he was gone. She searched for hours, calling his name until her voice broke. At dawn, she found him sitting on the embankment, head in his hands. His camera hung open, film half pulled. He looked up at her and said, "I can't do this anymore." She knelt beside him. "Then don't," she said. He didn't answer. The next morning he told her he was leaving France for a while, Spain first, then maybe North Africa. She asked if he would write. He said yes. He didn't. The last time she saw him, he was standing on the platform at Gare d'Austerlitz, his bag over his shoulder. She wanted to say something important, but all that came out was, "Take care." He smiled, that same brief smile from the first day. Then the train took him, and the platform filled with steam and strangers. She went home and wrote a letter. He never answered. For years afterward, she would catch herself looking for him in crowds, or pausing when she heard a camera shutter. Years later, the photograph he took that first day appeared in a small magazine. A young woman caught mid-turn, rain in her hair, eyes bright with surprise. The caption read only, "Paris, 1971. She tore it out and kept it, folded in half, inside a book of poems. Now, half a century later, the letter lay on her table. The ink was new, but the voice was the same. And somewhere in the rhythm of the waves outside her window, she could still hear that shutter click, the beginning of everything. Chapter 3. The Return Letter. The post office was only a mile down the road, but Eleanor walked slowly, letting the morning open around her. Mist clung to the hedges. The sea smelled sharp, like iron and salt. She carried his letter in her coat pocket, folded and soft from handling. It felt like a living thing against her chest. The woman at the counter greeted her by name. "Morning, Miss Marsh." "Morning. Only the one today." Eleanor nodded and slid the envelope forward. It was blank, waiting for a stamp. The woman turned it over. "France," she said, squinting at the address. "Haven't sent one there in a while." Neither have I. You'll want the blue airmail. Eleanor nodded again. The stamp was small and blue as the sky outside the window. She pressed it into place with her thumb. The woman said, "Looks important." "It's a reply," Eleanor said. "To what?" "To the past." The woman laughed, not sure if it was a joke. When the letter slipped from Eleanor's hand into the slot, she felt a small weight lift from her. Outside, the sky had cleared. At home, the afternoon stretched wide and slow. She tried to read, but ended up pacing the rooms. The sea's light kept shifting on the ceiling, the way it did when clouds moved fast. Every sound reminded her of waiting. The clock, the gulls, the kettle beginning to hiss. She took out a notebook and wrote a few lines, not a poem exactly, more like a rehearsal of feeling. "If you had written sooner, I might not have answered. But you waited long enough for me to forget the anger and remember the rest." She crossed it out. Too deliberate. She didn't want to sound like a poet writing about herself. She wanted to sound like the woman who once stood on the Pont Neuf, calling his name until the morning came. She began again. "Dear James, your letter found me on a cold morning. The sea was gray. The kettle had just boiled. I thought, for a moment, that I was dreaming. But the handwriting was yours, though smaller, more careful. Age does that to all of us. I don't know what made you write. I won't ask. I'm only glad you did. You said you remember me by the river. I remember you there too. The camera, the cigarette, the way you leaned on the railing as if the water might answer something for you. I've wondered all my life what became of that photograph. If you still have it, keep it. If you don't, forget it. We were only passing through each other's light for a time, but it seems that light stayed." Eleanor. She looked at the page and felt an ache behind her ribs. It was not sorrow exactly, more like recognition. She sealed the letter and set it by the door. That night Anna called again. "Well?" she asked. "Well, what? Did you answer him?" "Yes." "Good girl. What did you say?" "Too much and not enough." Anna laughed. "You always did talk like a novelist." "I was never a novelist." "No, but you were always something dangerous to them. To men. To time," Anna said. "You never got small the way the rest of us did." Eleanor smiled. "You're drunk." "Of course I am. It's Tuesday. I'll come by tomorrow. Bring stories." When she hung up, the quiet came back, but it was gentler now, like air after rain. For days she thought of the letter traveling. Over the channel, across the flat fields of France, toward a town she had never seen. She imagined the envelope in his hands, the way his thumb might brush the crease in the paper, the way he might read it twice before putting it down. And then she began to remember the things she hadn't written. How she'd married a man who loved her words more than her silence. How the marriage had ended quietly, like a candle burning out in a bright room. How the child they never had become an idea she carried instead of a grief. There were whole chapters of her life that James knew nothing about. And yet one thin page between them had opened a door she thought was long bricked shut. On the 5th evening after she'd posted it, the weather turned wild. Wind shook the roof. Rain hit the windows like thrown sand. She lit candles when the power failed and sat at the table with a blanket around her shoulders. The sea was invisible, but she could hear it, a constant, low roar under everything else. In the flicker of the candles, she thought she saw his face again, not as it had been, but as it might be now. Older, lined, softer at the edges. She imagined him writing, perhaps by the same unsteady light. Maybe he was also remembering the rain on the Pont Neuf, the shouts, the smoke, the sound of a shutter closing over youth. She whispered his name once, just to test how it still felt in her mouth. It felt right. When morning came, the storm had passed. The sky was clean and hard and blue. She went outside with her coffee, still wearing her slippers. The air smelled of wet grass and salt. A gull hovered above the cliff, holding steady against the wind. Eleanor felt light again. Not young, that was gone, but clear. There was something to wait for, and waiting, she realized, was a kind of life in itself. She went back inside, looked at the empty table, and smiled. Sooner or later, another letter would come. The story had begun to move again. Chapter 4, The River Seine. The city was restless that spring. Rain came in bursts, washing the posters from the walls and leaving the stones smelling of iron. Eleanor and James walked the long curve of the river most evenings after the crowds thinned. They liked the noise of the water, the steady voice that covered what they didn't yet know how to say. He carried the camera again, though he rarely lifted it now. His hands stayed in his pockets, shoulders drawn. When he spoke, his words seemed to come from somewhere far off. "They're sending me south again," he said. "Who is?" "The paper. There's a border crisis near Perpignan. Refugees coming through the mountains." "How long?" "A week. Maybe 2. She stopped walking. "You said that last time." He looked at her, rain in his hair. "This one pays." "It always pays," she said. He didn't answer. They stood there, the traffic humming above them on the bridge. A barge passed, lights dragging across the dark water. When he finally reached for her hand, she let him. His palm was cold, damp with rain. They crossed to the left bank, passing bookstalls closed for the night. The air smelled of wet paper and cheap wine. She said, "You'll come back?" "Yes." "Say it like you mean it." "I will come back." She wanted to believe him. He wanted her to. They stopped beneath a tree near the Pont Neuf. The branches hung low, heavy with blossoms that glowed pale in the streetlight. She rested her head against his chest. He kissed her hair and said, almost to himself, "It's strange, the way love feels like work when it should be rest." She lifted her face. "Then rest." He kissed her again. The river moved quietly behind them. Later, in the small room, they tried to speak, but words got tangled with touch. He said he hated the noise of the world. She said she hated the way he vanished into it. They argued softly, half-dressed, the argument turning into something else. When it was over, they lay facing opposite walls, listening to the city breathe through the thin windows. In the dark, she said, "If you go, don't send pictures. Send words." He whispered, "Words fail me." "Then let them." He laughed once, low and tired, and reached for her hand. They fell asleep like that, 2 small silhouettes pressed together against a room too large with silence. The next morning the sky cleared. He made coffee on the smoking stove. She watched him pour it, steady now, as if the night had smoothed something in him. He said, "You should come with me." "I can't. Exams." "Exams will wait." "They always do. That's the trouble." He smiled. "You talk like a poet." "I am one. You're a good one." "Then stay and let me write you properly." He shook his head. "If I stay, I'll stop seeing what I need to see." That was the last honest thing he said before he left. The day he went, Paris was washed clean. Trucks sprayed water over the streets, and the smell of soap hung in the air. He packed quickly, rolling his film and notebooks into the worn canvas bag. Eleanor made him a sandwich he didn't eat. At the door, he kissed her once, brief and dry, like someone closing a book before the last page. "I'll be back before you miss me," he said. She wanted to say, "I already do," but she didn't. The river looked different without him beside her. She went there every evening anyway, walking the same path, listening for the echo of his steps. The barges moved slow, heavy with freight and noise. Students leaned on the rails, smoking, arguing. The city kept living as if love were nothing remarkable. One night she saw his photograph printed in a newspaper left on a bench. A child in a blanket, eyes wide, mountains behind. The caption, "Border Exodus, 1971. Photo by James Armitage." She touched the image, her thumb smudging the ink. She felt proud, and then angry, and then proud again. She folded the page and put it in her bag. Weeks passed. His letters didn't come. She told herself the mail was slow, that he was moving too fast for paper to catch him. But at night, she lay awake listening to the river and thinking of the shutter click that used to follow their laughter. When the letter finally arrived, it was thin. Inside was a single photograph, her, standing by the Pont Neuf, hair blown across her face. On the back, in his small, rushed hand, "For when the light changes." No signature, no return address. She sat on the bed holding it until dawn. By the time the leaves turned, she had stopped going to the river. The cafes had new posters, new faces. Someone told her James had gone east, another said north. She stopped asking. It was easier to let him become a story than a man. Still, sometimes, when she crossed a bridge, she felt a pulse of memory in her chest. The smell of rain, the weight of his hand, the whisper of rest. That was how the past stayed with her. Not as pain, but as the small sound of water moving under stone. Chapter 5, The Voice. The package came on a Thursday morning, wrapped in brown paper and string. The handwriting was careful, the ink darker than before. No return address, only her name and the small coastal town printed beneath it. Inside the paper was a square object, wrapped again in tissue. A cassette. She hadn't seen one in years. Her hands shook a little as she turned it over. On the label, written in the same fine script, for when you want to listen, there was also a note. Eleanor, I found something that reminded me of the river. I thought perhaps it might speak better than I can. James. She read the note twice, then set it aside. The cassette lay on the table like a secret. She still had an old player, somewhere in the cupboard under the stairs, beside a coil of extension cords and forgotten tools. She went to find it. The machine was dusty, heavier than she remembered. She cleaned the heads with a tissue and plugged it in. It clicked faintly when she pressed play, like a heart remembering its rhythm. Then his voice filled the room. Eleanor, he said. It was slower now, lower, marked by age. She closed her eyes and let the sound move through her. I don't know where to begin, the voice continued. The truth is, I've been beginning again for years. Each time I think I've finished with the past, I find it waiting for me somewhere, in a photograph, or a face, or a name on an envelope. A pause, filled with the hum of distant air. Do you remember the river? I still hear it sometimes. When the light hits the lens just right, it sounds like water. That night you told me not to send pictures, only words. I didn't know what that meant. I think I do now. She put a hand to her throat. The sound of him seemed to fill every part of her that had gone still. He spoke again. I went south, like I said. The stories were worse than I expected. People leaving everything behind. Homes, names, even the language they cursed in. I took their pictures. The paper paid me well. And each time I pressed the shutter, I heard you telling me to rest. But there was no rest. There never is, when you start believing you can keep the world from vanishing by looking at it hard enough. The tape clicked lightly, a chair scraped. He must have recorded it in some quiet room. I lost the negatives in Madrid. Someone stole my bag. I didn't care. The only picture I kept was of you. Not because it was good. It wasn't. But it was true. She stopped the tape, needing air. Outside, the tide had come in, gray and bright. Gulls turned over the cliffs, crying. She walked down to the shore and stood where the waves broke soft against the stones. His voice still echoed inside her head, the way the sea does inside a shell. She stayed there a long while before going back in. She pressed play again. I should have written, the voice said. But I didn't know how to explain what happened after Spain. There was a camp. Children. Disease. A man shot in front of me for stealing bread. I took no photographs that day. I couldn't lift the camera. For the first time, I looked at something and thought, this isn't mine to keep. I left the paper soon after. Drifted. Worked odd jobs. Sometimes I saw your picture on old contact sheets and thought, she's still walking along that river, waiting for me to finish the story. Eleanor, I never finished it. But I kept the reel of your laughter, somewhere in the back of my head. It's the only sound that still feels alive. He drew in a breath. Anyway, I hope you're somewhere by the sea. You always said you wanted the sea close enough to hear it think. If you still write, I hope the words are kind to you. Then silence. The tape spun out to its end and clicked. Eleanor sat a long time before she moved. The room felt both smaller and larger, as if the air had changed shape. She looked at the cassette, that fragile thing, holding the shape of his breath, and thought of how time records us even when we stop speaking. She picked up a pen. A new sheet of paper lay before her. The page stayed blank for several minutes, the sea murmuring beyond the window. Then she wrote, James, you still sound like yourself. The pauses, the doubt. It's strange, but I could see your hands as you spoke. They moved the same way when you explained a photograph. You never noticed, but I did. I'm glad you stopped taking pictures that day. Some moments aren't meant to be trapped. They live better in the dark, where memory tends them. The sea is close, yes. I hear it at night. It sounds like breath, not water. Maybe that's what time becomes in the end. If this is to be our last conversation, let it be one of kindness. You've already given me what I didn't know I needed, your voice. She folded the letter but didn't seal it. She didn't know yet if she would send it. That evening Anna came by, bringing bread and soup. You look flushed, she said. I listened to something. Oh, music? A voice. Anna studied her. His. Eleanor nodded. And he sounds alive. Anna smiled gently. That'll do for now. They ate in silence, the soup steaming between them. When Anna left, Eleanor put the cassette away in a drawer. She knew she'd play it again, not soon, but someday. That night, as she drifted toward sleep, the last words she heard were not from the tape, but from her own memory. James laughing beside the river, saying, It's strange, the way love feels like work when it should be rest. And for the first time in years, she slept without dreaming. Chapter 6. Letters in Blue Ink. The postmark said Toulouse. 2 weeks after the cassette. The envelope was thin, sealed neatly, her name written in his careful, almost architectural hand. Inside, a single sheet, pale blue, the writing small but firm. He had used ink again, not black, not gray, but blue, the color of quiet mornings. Eleanor, I didn't expect you to answer, though I hoped you might. I listened to your letter more than I read it. I could hear you between the lines. Funny how silence can sound like someone you knew half a life ago. I'm in the South now. A small village, one road, one cafe, one old man who talks to me about fishing and women he's outlived. I take no pictures. I just watch the light slide along the river. It isn't the Seine, but it moves the same way, steady, unashamed of its age. If you'd like, write to me here. I'm not running anymore. James. She read it 3 times before setting it on the table. The ink had bled slightly where he must have paused, his hand resting too long. It made the words seem softer, as if time itself had leaned on the page. She poured tea, carried the cup to the window. Outside, the sea flashed like a blade in the afternoon light. She thought, so this is how it starts again, not with fire, but with patience. That night, she wrote her reply. James, blue suits you. It always did. I still have the scarf you bought me in Montparnasse, the one I said I didn't like. I was wrong. I wear it on cold walks and tell the gulls it came from someone who understood the weather. You say you're watching the light on the river. I do the same with the sea. It changes more often than the heart does, and more honestly. Perhaps we've both come to prefer things that move without asking permission. If you're not running anymore, then stay long enough for me to write again. She didn't reread it. She sealed it and posted it the next morning before she could soften it with too much thought. Weeks passed in a rhythm of envelopes, each one in blue ink, each one folding a little more of the years between them. In one, he told her about the cafe, the chipped cups, the dog that slept under the table, the widow who ran it and kept her hair tied with a red ribbon. In another, she wrote about the sea storms, how the power went out and she read by candlelight, pretending she was still in Paris, 22, broke, certain of nothing and therefore alive. Their words crossed countries and time zones like small, steady boats. The mailman began to smile when he saw her at the gate. More from France, he'd say. She'd answer, it must be the weather there, and he'd nod, as if he understood. Then one morning, a thicker envelope arrived. Inside were 3 pages, written close together. He sounded restless, as if the letters had opened too many doors. Eleanor, I keep dreaming of the river. Not the Seine as it was, not the noise, not the protests, but something quieter. In the dream you're there, standing on the bridge. You turn, and I can't tell if you're smiling or not. Maybe it's the light. You said once that some moments live better in the dark. I think you were right. But some need to be spoken again, if only to prove they were real. I never asked, did you forgive me for leaving? I don't mean the train or the letters that didn't come. I mean for the silence that followed. The silence that became me. She read that line. The silence that became me. And felt something twist deep in her chest. Forgiveness was not a word she used easily. It was too heavy, too final. But she knew what he meant. Her answer came slowly, across 2 evenings and a storm. James, forgiveness is a kind of forgetting, and I'm too old for that. But I can say this. The girl you left became a woman who learned to live with unfinished stories. Maybe that's what we were, an unfinished story that refused to fade. You don't need forgiveness. You need a place to rest. I hope that's what you found there, near your river. When I walk by the sea now, I sometimes imagine you walking beside it from the other side of the world. Perhaps that's enough. Eleanor, when she finished, she didn't cry. She felt a clean tiredness, the kind that comes after hard weather. She sealed the letter and placed it on the sill, letting the morning light touch it before sending it away. Winter came. The post slowed. She kept writing, even without replies. Short notes at first, then longer ones, as if speaking to a friend who had simply gone quiet. Sometimes she wrote poems again, though she didn't call them that. She called them letters that didn't need to travel. In January, a postcard arrived, a photograph of the river at dusk, all bronze and shadow. On the back, in blue ink. Still watching the light. You were right about the sea. It never lies. She held it to her lips, the way one does with something that isn't quite prayer. Then she pinned it to the corkboard above her desk. That night, Anna phoned. "You sound brighter," she said. "I'm writing again." "Good. About him?" "About the light." Anna laughed softly. "Same thing, isn't it?" Eleanor smiled. Outside, the moon rose through a thin sheet of cloud, a pale coin tossed to the tide. She thought of all the letters crossing the air between them, blue words folded against the dark, and how strange it was that after all these years, the quiet had finally begun to speak. Chapter 7. The Journey South. She packed lightly. A coat, a scarf, her notebook, and a small bag of essentials. The letter from James sat on top, the blue ink visible through the folds. She looked at it one last time and whispered, "All right then." The train station smelled of damp stone and coal smoke. The platform was empty, except for a few early commuters. She bought a ticket with trembling hands and found a seat by the window. The whistle blew. The train lurched forward. The countryside rolled past in winter green and gray. She watched rivers slip under bridges, towns flash like memories. Each one seemed familiar and foreign at the same time. She thought of James and his village, the cafe, the river moving steadily under the light. The thought made her pulse quicken. A young woman in the carriage smiled at her. "Going far. South," Eleanor said. "That sounds brave." "Or foolish," she replied. The woman laughed and returned to her book. She wrote while the train moved. Short lines, fragments of thought, as if capturing the rhythm of the journey. The landscape is slow and patient. I am neither. I am catching the words he left behind, trying to make them real again. The conductor passed twice. Eleanor tucked the notebook back in her bag each time, pretending to read the scenery. At a small station near Toulouse, she changed trains. The second train smelled of oil and leather. She sat with her coat over her knees, looking at the passing fields. Each village was a breath, a pause in a long sentence. She wondered if he was watching for her, the way she had watched the Seine all those years ago. The letters had guided her, the cafe, the river, the description of the bridge where he often walked. She followed each clue as if the geography were a map of memory. She imagined him in his chair at the cafe, reading the letters, fingers resting on the paper the way he had once rested on the camera. At night, she slept in a small inn, the room smelling of wood polish and old carpets. The moonlight stretched across the floor, pale as his handwriting on the page. She dreamed of rivers and bridges, of the dark water catching the light. On the third day, she arrived at the village. It was smaller than she imagined. One main road, a few stone houses, the river curling around the edge. The cafe sat at the corner, shutters closed for the winter. Smoke curling from the chimney. She paused, hesitant, the envelope of her latest letter clutched in her hand. This was it, the place he had described. A man emerged from the cafe, carrying a tray of dishes. Eleanor froze. He looked up, eyes catching hers for the briefest moment. Then he was gone inside. She realized she didn't know what to do next. She walked along the riverbank. The water moved cold and certain, reflecting the gray sky. Her shoes scuffed the stones. She stopped at the small bridge he had mentioned in a letter, the one he said he liked to watch the light. The river's edge looked different from the photograph on the postcard, but the movement was the same. A voice came behind her. "Eleanor." She turned. The man standing there was older, lines in his face, gray at the temples, but it was him. James. He didn't smile at first. He only looked. And in that look, she felt the years fold into themselves, the decades pressing into a single breath. "James," she said, her voice catching. "Eleanor," he said finally. The words were thin, simple enough. The river ran between them, steady and endless. The wind carried a faint smell of smoke and wood, like the cafe inside. He held out his hand. She took it. They didn't speak at first. They only walked together along the bank, the water moving under the winter sky. Later, in the cafe, they sat across from each other with hot wine. No letters, no photographs. Only the moment. The owner, an old widow with the red ribbon in her hair, poured the wine silently. She didn't ask questions. She only watched, as if she had seen this happen before. James said, "It's been a long time." "Yes," Eleanor said. "The river hasn't changed much. It moves fast enough to make us seem slow." He laughed softly. She smiled. The letters had led her here. The journey had been long, but the river had waited. And now, finally, so had he. Chapter 8. The House by the Sea. The house smelled of cedar and salt. Eleanor had rented it for the month, small and white, with shuttered windows and a low roof that creaked in the wind. James arrived carrying a single bag and a camera, though he didn't lift it once. They stood in the doorway for a moment, neither speaking, listening to the sea claw at the rocks below. He finally said, "It's smaller than I imagined." "It's enough," she said. "Enough. Enough to see the water. Enough to hear it think." Inside, the rooms were simple. A kitchen with a stove, a table worn from decades of use, 2 chairs, a sofa with a slipcover. Eleanor placed her bag down. James moved to the window and looked at the sea. "It hasn't changed," he said. "No," she said. "The tide still knows its place. Better than we do." They made coffee in silence, each wrapped in their own thoughts. He poured his cup carefully, the liquid steaming. She sipped hers and watched him, noting the lines around his eyes, the slow way he exhaled. It felt strange to see him like this, older, quieter, still familiar. After breakfast, they walked down to the shore. The wind bit at their cheeks. They didn't hold hands, not at first. Their footsteps tracked the edge of the water. He said, "Do you remember the first time I took your picture?" "I do. I was annoyed. You were perfect anyway." She laughed softly. "You always said that." "I meant it," he said. At night, they lit candles. The house smelled of wax and salt. James sat in a chair with his camera on his lap, looking at the floorboards. Eleanor sat across from him with her notebook. They wrote and watched each other write, the silence between them a kind of conversation. Then she said, "You could stay here longer." "You know." "I could," he said. And I might, if the tide allows it." She smiled. They laughed quietly, the sound carried into the room by the candlelight. Days passed like this, small routines, long walks, the sea moving steadily under the windows. Sometimes they spoke. Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes the words they said were not enough, and the silence said everything. One afternoon, a storm came. Rain pounded the windows. They stayed inside, drinking tea and listening to the wind. James said, "It reminds me of Paris. Not the protests, just the rain on the rooftops. I thought the sea would have scared you off by now." "It might have, but it's persistent. Like you." "I've had practice," she said. He reached across the table, fingers brushing hers. "Persistent in the best way," he said. They began to speak more freely of the past, of the choices that had separated them, of the letters that had kept them near, even when far apart. Neither of them sought blame. They only sought understanding. "You never wrote back after Spain," she said one evening. "I didn't know how," he admitted. "You could have tried," she said. "I tried in other ways," he said. "Other ways?" "By looking. By keeping you in the frame, always." She looked at him and saw the truth in his eyes. By the second week, the rhythm of living together had formed. They cooked meals, drank wine, walked the cliffs. They read aloud to each other from books they had carried for decades. Sometimes the reading stopped mid-sentence, and they would sit, listening to the sea or to each other's breathing. One night, James said, "I never thought I'd sit like this again. With you. At this age. You never thought, or you didn't believe." "I didn't believe," he said. "You should believe more," she said. He smiled softly. "I'm learning." The house became their small universe. The sea their constant companion. They did not speak of the future, except in fragments and gestures. A hand on the shoulder, a shared cup of tea, the careful placement of a chair near the window. It was enough that they were here, together, old but alive, listening to the water move and the light change. At night, Eleanor wrote letters she did not send. She wrote in blue ink, the same color he had chosen. Sometimes she read them to him. Sometimes she read them to the sea. And sometimes she simply listened, letting the voice on the tape replay in her mind. On the final night of the month, a candle burned low. They sat close, the wind rattling the shutters. James said, "I'm glad you came." "I'm glad I did," Eleanor said. The sea roared below, relentless and patient. And for the first time in decades, neither felt the weight of the years between them. The past had not disappeared. It had folded into the present, and in the quiet of the house by the sea, it was enough. Chapter 9. Confessions and Shadows. The morning was gray. Rain hit the roof in irregular bursts. Eleanor sat at the table, notebook open, pen in hand. James moved quietly around the kitchen, making tea. The silence between them was heavier than it had been in weeks. Finally, he spoke. You never asked why I stopped writing after Spain. She put down her pen. I didn't think I wanted the answer. You do now? She didn't say anything. He poured the tea and handed her a cup. I saw things, he said. Things I shouldn't have. Things that made me think I didn't deserve to write to you. Or anyone. She sipped the tea. Like what? People dying, he said. Children. A man shot for bread. I couldn't capture it in a photograph without lying to myself. So I stopped. She nodded slowly, understanding without judgment. You should have told me. I thought silence was easier. For both of us. The wind rattled the shutters. Eleanor set her cup down. You think silence is easier, she said, but it's not. It's just lonelier. He looked at her, eyes darkened by years and shadows. I know, he admitted. Her fingers brushed the edge of his hand on the table. A small gesture, but it held the weight of everything unsaid. Later, they walked along the cliffs. The sea was restless. James stopped and looked out over the water. Do you ever wonder, he said, what would have happened if I hadn't left Paris? If I had stayed, all the time, Eleanor said. You think it would have been better? Maybe worse, she said. Or maybe different. I don't know. He laughed softly, almost bitterly. Yes, different. That's all I can be sure of. They continued walking, but a shadow followed them. The past folded into the present. That night, Eleanor made dinner. James helped, but the conversation was careful, deliberate. She said, There's more you haven't told me. He paused. Yes, he said. There is. He told her about the photograph he never sent, the one he had kept hidden in a drawer for decades. It was of a boy, a refugee child, standing alone in a field with mountains behind him. Why didn't you send it? She asked. I couldn't, he said. It wasn't about the world seeing it. It was about me understanding what I had done. Eleanor looked at him. You carried it for yourself. Yes. And you were afraid I wouldn't understand. I was. She reached across the table. You do now, she said. He nodded. The storm intensified. Rain lashed the windows. They sat in the living room, side by side, listening to the wind. Eleanor said, I've held things too. Secrets. Things that might have hurt you if I'd said them. James looked at her. Tell me, he said. She took a deep breath. I married once, she said. It ended quietly. There was no anger, just absence. I wanted a child. There wasn't one. I thought I'd lost myself in the waiting. He listened. I think, she continued, I was waiting for this, for you, in ways I didn't even know. He put his hand over hers. It's not too late, he said. Later, they moved closer, the heat from the stove warming their backs. The conversation slowed, the words unnecessary. She rested her head on his shoulder. He kissed her hair, the movement careful, reverent. You never stopped loving, he said softly. I never stopped waiting, she said. The wind rattled again, but inside the house, there was warmth. Before bed, James went to the window and looked out at the sea. I was afraid, he said. Afraid that the past would ruin what we might have now. It won't, Eleanor said. Promise. I can only promise to be here, she said. They held each other in the dark, shadows stretching across the walls. The storm outside faded into a steady drizzle. They fell asleep with the sound of the sea in their ears, knowing that confession had lifted something heavy, yet left them tender, fragile, alive. The next morning, the sun broke through the clouds. The tide was low, revealing the rocks Eleanor remembered from her childhood walks. James stood beside her on the cliffs. Shall we go down? He asked. Yes, she said. Together, they stepped toward the water. The past had been spoken. The present waited. And the sea kept moving, as it always had. Chapter 10, The Light Changes. Morning came slow and pale. The sea stretched silver under the sky, low tide revealing stones slick with moss. Eleanor opened the shutters and let the wind in. James was already awake, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee, the notebook open in front of him. He looked up and smiled, that small, quiet smile she had loved for years. Good morning, he said. Good morning, she replied. The words were ordinary, yet they held everything. The letters, the journeys, the waiting. They walked along the cliffs after breakfast. The wind tugged at Eleanor's scarf. Do you remember our first day here? She asked. He nodded. I remember. You said the sea was thinking. It still is. And do you? I do, she said. But sometimes it's hard to hear anything besides the tide. They paused at the edge of the cliff. The waves broke against the rocks, white foam rolling back into the gray. James reached for her hand. She let him hold it, the warmth of their fingers a quiet answer to all the years. Back in the house, they wrote again. Not letters this time, just notes, fragments of thought. James sketched small drawings of the river he had loved, the sea she had kept. Eleanor wrote poems that didn't need titles. They read aloud to each other, laughed quietly, paused to watch the light move through the window. Sometimes they didn't speak at all. They only existed side by side, listening to the rhythm of the house, the wind, the water. One evening, the light changed. It fell across the table like a golden blade, catching the edges of their cups, their pens, their hands. James watched Eleanor's face, saw the years in the curve of her jaw and the soft lines around her eyes. "You're beautiful," he said, softly, almost to himself. "I know," she said, smiling. "And you're patient." "I've learned," he said. The words were enough. They went to the cliffs for the last walk before night. The sea was calm now, gray reflecting silver, quiet. They held hands and didn't speak. The storm had passed, the years had passed. And still, here they were. James knelt down to examine a tide pool. "Look," he said, "even here, life persists." Eleanor bent beside him. Tiny crabs scuttled, shells glinting in the fading light. She laughed softly. "Yes," she said, "even here." That night, the house was quiet. Candles burned low. They sat together by the window, listening to the sea. Eleanor thought of the letters, the cassette, the photographs, the journeys that had brought them here. The past was present now, folded into the warmth of the room. James said, "I never thought we'd have this." "Nor I," Eleanor said. "Are we too old? Too old to wait?" "No, too old for anything but this." "Yes." They held each other close. Outside, the moonlight caught the waves. It was steady and certain, as it had always been. Eleanor rested her head on James' shoulder. He kissed her hair. They did not speak again that night. They did not need to. The light changed, slow and quiet. It moved across their hands, across the table, across the walls of the house by the sea. And for the first time in decades, it was enough. The sea whispered, and they listened. End of chapter 10, The Light Changes. This closes the novel with quiet resolution, honoring the stormy, layered love story while leaving the emotional resonance lingering like the sound of waves. If you want, I can also create a short prologue and epilogue for this audiobook version, designed to immerse the listener at the start and leave them reflective at the very end. This can enhance the audio experience dramatically. Do you want me to do that?